First and foremost, thanks to everyone who's listening to this podcast, is sharing it with friends and family, and is overall connecting. I'd love for you if you could subscribe and like and follow. Just spread the word. This podcast was created so we could connect and over our life abroad, and we could get a bit of comfort from these episodes about mental health. Thank you very much again, and I hope you enjoy this episode about boundaries. So welcome back to We Are Here Too, a podcast about mental health and life abroad. I am Francesca, an Italian counsellor living in Scotland. This season, we've been exploring relationships, the ones we have with ourselves, with others, and the world around us. Boundaries and family. Those two words don't always seem to go together today. And in so many cultures and family systems, the idea of setting limits with family can feel wrong, like you're being selfish and like you're breaking some, unspoken rules about how family should work. And this is like a huge topic, much bigger than just one conversation, I suppose, or one podcast episode. Boundaries in families are complex no matter what, but today I would like to explore them in the context of distance, when a family isn't just emotionally close but physically far. And because when you live in a different country from your family, boundaries don't always look like the same. Some feel easier. Maybe the physical space gives you a buffer from certain dynamics that were difficult when you live close. But other boundaries feel harder because distance creates certain, expectations that we've mentioned before, you should call more often, you should visit more, we never see you, when we do, it's never long enough. I brought many examples around this already about my family dynamics, where, at times there was a running jokes, even among the neighbors being like, oh, Francesca, how long are you going to stay this time around? 3 hours? Yes, I'm gonna stay 12 this time around, which I did. I once stayed only 12 hours, just to have brunch with friends. But plane tickets were also much cheaper than they are now. There is this unspoken pressure to make up for the fact that we are away. We live far away. So we need to be extra present, extra available, extra involved, even when that's not always possible. Almost this unspoken pressure to make up for the fact that we are very far away. It comes we need to compensate. And then there is guilt, not new to this podcast, talking about guilt and life abroad. Because with family, boundaries don't just exist in the moment. They just don't exist in the moment you set them. They just echo. So you might find yourself questioning, am I being unfair? Am I making things harder than they need to be? What if they're hurt and I am the reason? And it's so easy done, right? We've shared this plenty of time about how it is difficult to move abroad, and on one side there is this narrative that because we moved away we need to compensate and make all these extra efforts, and then on the other side we have all of those feelings of what am I doing? My family's lives are moving on, and I am here and I'm missing out on very important benchmarks in people's life. I had a niece and a nephew, being born as I am away, and my parents moved house once. My sisters moved out 3 times already. And I'm missing out all of these things. My sister's first job, and my sister's relationships with their partners. I'm missing out all of this, to get to know them properly. And sometimes it's connections and conversations with them happen like in a very short period of time. Everything feels a bit like a pressure cooker, right? Because I'm saying that for very little, I'm living with them, we spend 24 hours together, and we're not used to anymore. You know how it goes, right? Like it can go great, it can go not so great. But here's the thing, right? Boundaries aren't about shutting people out. They are about making space for connection in a way that actually feels good rather than overwhelming. And they allow us to stay present in relationships without feeling like we're losing ourselves in them. So yeah, there may be a bit of a pressure cooker, but I'm not like completely overwhelming myself and shutting myself down and shutting people down and, maybe rupture very precarious relationships anyway, because we're not very close, because there is a lot of physical distance in between us. But let's admit it, that even knowing that, it's really hard. And it's one thing to understand the boundaries are healthy, right? And another thing entirely is to set them, especially when you know they might not be received well. I always find like it's very easy for me to sit here and say like, oh yeah, boundaries, just set them up, people will understand, which is not true. People do not understand boundaries. People actually react to boundaries, especially if they're new, because they are, you are creating, let's put it this way, you are creating a new pattern. You're going to start a new pattern, a new cycle, which is unfamiliar, it's unexpected, and it's unknown, and it's unpredictable, right? Like, so all the elements, all the recipes for a disaster, right? Like if we're not in a very good place and we're struggling managing things, so they're really hard. Not everyone is in the space for embracing them. And let's admit it, guys, like we live in capitalism, so when do we even have the space for these things when we are trying to survive, right? When we then try to navigate boundaries with family, the question that comes to mind is always like, how do we do that when we live apart and we live far away? How do we hold space for love and connection without sacrificing our own needs? And that's what we're going to explore in this episode, basically. Sometimes living far away isn't just about opportunity, it's about really emotional survival. And not everyone moves abroad simply for adventure or a job or love, right? Like for some distance is what makes family relationships possible in the first place. But even when distance is necessary, it doesn't always feel good, because there is guilt and deep, like nagging feeling that you should be doing more, right? And that you should be able to stay close and protect yourself at the same time, that by stepping back, you are somehow failing your family, or worse, you are abandoning them. And when aging parents are in the picture, that guilt gets louder, and it tells you like that you really should visit more often, or that you should be the one checking in every day. What if something happens and you weren't there, right? Like all things that we discussed like in the last week episode. But here's the thing, right? Like distance isn't just about absence. It can also be an act of care and a way of making space for a relationship to exist in a way that's actually sustainable. And because being physically present doesn't automatically mean being available, not in the way your family might want, at least, and not in the way you might want either. And forcing yourself into proximity that feels overwhelming and draining or even harmful, it doesn't actually strengthen those relationships, but it depletes you. And I remember the times my dad would ask me to visit more, right? And it wasn't just a casual request. He carried weight and expectation. And when I couldn't, I felt almost reprimanded for it. Like I wasn't doing enough. But then I did visit. And he wouldn't actually necessarily make an effort to spend time with me. And at that time, I was hurt by it. I had rearranged my life to be there, and yet he didn't feel like my presence mattered in the way it would. And I was flooded with guilt. Guilt for not visiting more, guilt for not knowing how to fit them into my life better, guilt for needing space to feel okay. And now I generally do see it differently. For example, I learned that my dad didn't know how to bridge the gap either. I mean, how could he, right? Like, that was his first time too. Having like a child, moving abroad, and being not very clear about like her future plan. Like, I wasn't clear. I had no idea. I left being like, yeah, I'm leaving. Bye. And I had who knows, right? Like, and he knew how to ask me to go home. That was like what he knew what to do. But he didn't necessarily know what to do once I was there. And that's something I think a lot of us experience, right? Like that realization that our parents might not always have the tools to create the kind of closeness they long for. And there is a lot that gets misunderstood. So maybe instead of asking, how do I get rid of this guilt? Maybe the better question, or a better question, would be, what do I need in order to stay connected without losing myself in the process? Or like, how can I be present in a way that feels true to the relationship rather than an obligation? And sometimes there is a bit of flex we need to make so that we actually are more receptive to our parents' way of communicating. That maybe now, because we have distance, we can actually integrate, right? Like they're not there. So why not giving a bit more space to this? Without the consequences of that closeness that maybe was one of the causes for you leaving in the first place. And this is where I would like to bring in something that Abigail Rose Clark talks about in the book, Returning Home to Our Bodies, which I do love, right? Like, I brag about the book all the time. She describes how our cells show us the wisdom of boundaries. And she talks about like boundaries aren't walls and they breathe. The cells are constantly exchanging nutrients and they are responding to what's needed, letting things in while also filtering and protecting. And we know this deep in our bodies, like our cells know this, right? Like, and maybe family boundaries work in the same way. They aren't fixed, immovable things. They perspire, meaning that things pass through them. There's a give and take, and boundaries don't have to mean cutting off. They can mean staying in relationship without the self-sacrifice. They can mean allowing connection without absorbing everything. And that's where we land with this episode, at least, right? Like, that this isn't about drawing a line to keep people out. It's about creating enough space to still want to be in each other's lives. And sometimes we don't communicate this enough to the people we care about. That may be like the reason why we have these boundaries, because we want people in our life. Otherwise, we would cut them off, right? Otherwise, if we thought this was unsolvable and we didn't care at all and we suffered too much, we would think of how we can actually get rid of them. But if you're here and you're listening to this episode and you're like, yeah, I actually would like to have a better relationship with my family, that's the thing, that's the part, right? Like, it's about like communicate, like, I actually want to be close to you and I still want to love you, but I need to put this in place, otherwise it's not working, if that's the words that you've used, right? Like, and if you feel like these words can actually be received too. So how do we do that, right? Like, how do we communicate boundaries in ways that don't create more distance, but instead allow for a different kind of closeness, Moving away doesn't just mean physical distance. It really does shift everything. the way we relate to home, the way family sees us, and the silent expectations that follow us across borders. And in many cultures, family is meant to come first and no questions asked. And when we leave, whether for a job or relationship, simply because we needed to, there's this unspoken expectation that will be the one keeping the connection alive. That we should be the one to call, to visit, to fit ourselves back into the rhythms of home whenever we return. But what happens when family doesn't respect the space we need, right? And in many families, saying no isn't just a personal decision, and it's seen as a rejection of the family itself. So if you say you can't visit, it's not just logistics, it's so you don't want to see us. Or, for example, like if you ask for space in a difficult conversation, sometimes it can translate like, oh, you don't care about what we are going through. Or, I don't know, you're trying to balance your life abroad with family obligations, and you're just like, oh, you've just changed. Boundaries can be misread as distance, and distance can be misread as disinterest. But here's the truth. The boundaries aren't about pushing family away. They're about creating enough space to stay in relationship without losing yourself in it. So basically, boundaries are many things. Boundaries are about preserving our identity. It's about making sure that we don't get swallowed by dynamics and situationships. Boundaries are there so that we can actually stay in connection. So they basically allow us to connect and be present. There are many ways we can, hold boundaries with family without closing the door. But please just know that I'm just offering some pointers, and in no way they substitute maybe your own ways of doing this. So first and foremost, I would say boundaries are just not a rejection. And setting limits doesn't mean shutting family out. It means finding a way to stay connected in a way that actually works for you. So this is very important. Set them. Basically, that's my point. Just set them. You cannot talk about them. You just need to set them. And once you set them, you need to stay put. Do not waver. That's the thing. That's the. I suppose that's everyone's problem, or most people's problems, right? If we manage to set boundaries, then what happens to those boundaries if they can be crossed without consequences? Maybe we want to go for soft consequences to begin with, right? Just to test the waters. So maybe it's about saying oh, if you cross this boundary, I'm not going to talk to you ever again. Maybe it's about if you cross this boundary, I'm not going to stay here. Continue talking. We can resume tomorrow. As an example, okay? Your circumstances. Another one would be communicate with care. Instead of saying oh, I can't talk to you about this, maybe there are softer approaches to this. Remind them, I want to be present for our conversation, and I can do that when I feel overwhelmed. So let's talk when I have the space to really listen. That's a very good way in, And the last bit for me, it's let go of needing their full understanding. We won't always have the same way to understand what's going on, or the same words to describe what's going on. And sometimes there is a bit of meaning that gets lost in translation, okay? Especially if you speak another language for a very long period of time. That's so easy done. So not everyone will see boundaries as an act of care. Some might always interpret them as distance, but boundaries aren't about getting permission or approval. Just remember this, okay? They're about what allows you to show up fully instead of out of obligation. Maybe that's another concept that can be translated, right? You want to make sure that you are there because you want to be there, and not because you were manipulated into it. I'm not sure manipulation comes into place and people may feel that way. I don't know. How do you feel, right? What's your take on this, right? But ultimately we just want to stay because we care and we want to show that. And at the end of the day, the goal isn't separation. It's creating the kind of space where when you do show up on a call, on a visit, in whatever way you can, you're really there, and not just because you have to be, but because you want to be. Just remember this. And on a closing reflection, boundaries don't mean cutting people out. Again, they mean shaping relationships in ways that feel sustainable, so that connection isn't built on guilt, exhaustion, or obligation, but on something more solid and more intentional. Holding both love and limits, right? It's very hard. And it asks us to sit with discomfort, to let go of all patterns, to trust that space doesn't have to mean disconnection. But it's part of honoring not just yourself, but also the people in your life and the relationship itself. So as we close, I really want to leave you with a question. What does a relationship that feels mutually nourishing look like to you? And how might you start moving towards that? One conversation, one boundary, or one act of care at a time? Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Bye.